Welcome everybody. My name is Audrey. I'm the curator for the Michigan Street African American Heritage Corridor, and we thank you for joining us tonight for our last Black History Month talk of 2024. Tonight I have the pleasure of introducing Sharon Holley, who is one of our board members, but she's also the anchor representative from the Michigan Street Preservation Corporation, which owns the Nash House Museum. She's responsible for interpreting and preserving the historical integrity of this space, which is a historic landmark for the public, community, and visitors. Sharon is an active storyteller, a retired librarian, and had worked for the Buffalo and Erie County Libraries for 34 years. She, along with her husband Kenneth, owns Awadi Books at 1382 Jefferson Avenue. They are the parents of 3 daughters and 7 grandchildren, and Sharon is always busy running around doing things for the community. So please welcome Sharon.
Thank you. So I don't have a band. I know if you were here last week, there was music. So you're just going to have to pretend that I'm singing while I'm up here. Maybe not. Okay. So the title of my presentation tonight is, What Are You Reading, Reverend Nash? And I want to start out by saying Reverend Jesse Nash was born in Virginia in 1868. His parents were formerly enslaved. After graduating from Wheeling Seminary, which later merged to become Virginia Union University, he came to Buffalo in 1892 to be the pastor of the Michigan Street Baptist Church at 511 Michigan Avenue. This presentation is showing you what's inside the Nash House Museum. Reverend Nash moved into the house that you see here, which is at 36 Nash Street, which was formerly 36 Potter Street. He moved in here in 1925 after he married Miss Frances Jackson, who was a Buffalonian. The Nash family had one son. Jesse and Frances had one son, that was Jesse Nash Jr., and they occupied the second floor of this house. The first floor was rented out to others for extra income, and they only lived on the second floor. So I want to say my assistant with this project was Charles Alamo, who is a librarian at the Buffalo and Erie County Public Library. And it was Charles who had first gone into the house before it became a museum and began to try to index and list the books that were in the house. According to Charles, he found more than 2,000 books in Reverend Nash's collection. So he has quite a large collection, and I'm not going to review every book that's in that collection tonight. I'm just going to be talking about some of the highlights from that. As you can see from this, there were books on the shelves. Now, some of you may ask by the end of this, where are these books? The books are still in the house, but what you're seeing now as they show in the house are photographs of the books, the way they looked on the shelf. We are hoping in the future to be able to expand the Nash House Museum and have a spot where we can actually display the actual books for researchers and people who are doing works and research. I don't know if you can see some of the titles on there. One is The Destiny of Man, Egypt and the Books of Moses, Moody, His Words, Works, and Workers, Christ in History, Winning Souls. So I show you this to say that even though Reverend Nash was a pastor and had a lot of books on the Bible and Christianity, he also had books on other religion, and he read more than religious books. So you can see from this, books were in the shelf. There are some books that were actually in the house that are not on the shelf, but we do not let people who visit the house pick them up and thumb through them. And as I have been looking at some of the titles, some are worth a lot more than probably $250 that he paid for them at the time when he had them in the house. A particular interest was his interest in poetry. So this is a book by Henry Wadsworth Longfellow. It was the Book of Hiawatha that was given to Reverend Nash by Mrs. Mary B. Talbot, her husband and daughter, for Reverend Nash's birthday, May 1st in 1905. So they inscribed it, presented by Mr. and Mrs. W. Talbot and Sarah May Talbot to J. Edward Nash, May 1st, 1905. So the book from Hiawatha Longfellow was born in 1807 and died in 1882. And he was considered an abolitionist, but not a very strong abolitionist, but some of his poems pointed to the fact that he was in favor of abolition. Also showing that he was interested in poetry, in the collection, Reverend Nash had one of the first books of poetry that was written by Langston Hughes. So this book of poetry, called A New Song, was published by the International Workers' Order in 1938. And as you can see from the inside cover, it was signed by Langston Hughes. It has 17 poems in there. And after Langston Hughes published this book, it wasn't widely circulated because many people thought that there was a very strong anti-American slant to the poems. In fact, after he published the book, he was accused of being a communist, and he was also caught up in the hearings from MacArthur, trying to root out what they call the Red Scare in this country. And so the book stayed kind of hidden for a while, and it was later on when Langston Hughes began to put some of these poems in other books. Locally, there was the poet and writer, columnist, newspaper man of Mr. A.J. Smitherman. Mr. A.J. Smitherman, to our knowledge, only wrote one book of poems called Treasure Trove. Mr. Smitherman had a very interesting history, of course. He was not from Buffalo. He lived in Tulsa, Oklahoma. He was living in Tulsa, Oklahoma in 1921 at the time of the Tulsa Massacre. He was the editor of the Tulsa Star newspaper in Tulsa. And he wrote very scathing articles about what was going on in Tulsa, and as a result, he had to flee Tulsa. He ended up in one of the New England states, and later on, he relocated to Buffalo, New York, where he again started to publish a newspaper, first called the Buffalo Star, and later on, the Empire Star. So the Empire Star was a newspaper that carried the news of African Americans, and A.J. Smitherman was the publisher. In one issue of the Empire Star, he wrote a very long poem about the Tulsa Massacre, but that poem is not included in this book called The Treasure Trove. Reverend Nash was a friend of Mr. Smitherman, and as a friend, he wrote the foreword to the title of the book. I'm not sure if you were able to read it there. And let me just see if I can make it larger on my phone so that I could read it. Okay, in his foreword, he says, "Though the great many years that we have known our friend A.J. Smitherman, we have seen him in action in a number of capacities, and the results have been constructive. I think most persons who have known Mr. Smitherman through the years have known him as a newspaper man. He has been noted for his exceptionally fine editorials, which have appeared in the paper, the Empire Star, each week. Every now and then, he has given talks or brief lectures in which he has revealed much, but not all of his philosophy of life. In this little book of poems, he has given a larger and more complete view of his philosophy of life. In these poems, we find the hilarious and the serious that make us laugh sometimes and sometimes causes tears of sadness to drop from our eyes. To read these poems is to become better acquainted with the author. We hope that all who read these poems may receive the profit as that which has come to me. J. Edward Nash, pastor, Michigan Avenue Baptist Church, Buffalo, New York, April 19th, 1951. And there was also something in here written by the prominent lawyer and banker of Buffalo, Mr. Charles DeBow, where he also talked about how important A.J. Smitherman was and how important his writing was. So I also included one of the poems called Bound to Win. And this poem was interesting because it seemed to be written in a little bit of dialect, but it said, well, tain't no use of crying, might as well to sing a song. Tain't a bit of use of dying, 'cause the world is done gone wrong. 'Cause you's had a little trouble, but that's no cause for you to moan. What I's had is more than double all you had since you was born. But you see I keeps on smiling, just like I was sure enough glad, while my blood was almost boiling because some fool done made me mad. Yeah, look here, boy, you stop complaining before I slaps your ugly face. Is you done forgot your training, about to make me fall from grace? Lift your head, don't be no coward, that's the stuff, stick out your chin. Keep your eyes a-looking forward, don't give up, you're bound to win. So this was one of the shorter poems that was in the book, but there were also longer poems in there that talked about African Americans and talked about liberty and freedom in the book, Bound to Win. And according to Charles Alamo, who was doing some of the study of the books, this was the only known copy that he was able to find in the world. I'm like, okay, we got to keep this under glass. Because the family of A.J. Smitherman still lives in the city of Buffalo, and some are in New York, and they did come to Buffalo and wanted to view and take pictures of the book of poems that some had never seen before. So just to show you that Reverend Nash had a very varied reading, on his shelf he kept the complete works of Shakespeare along with a photograph of Shakespeare, and this was found right behind his desk where he would be writing out his sermons. So also in the collection was a book by his friend, Reverend Adam Clayton Powers Sr. Reverend Adam Clayton Powers Sr. and Reverend Nash were classmates in Richmond, Virginia at Virginia Union University. So after graduating from school, Reverend Powell was assigned to Abyssinia Baptist Church in Harlem, New York, and Reverend Nash came to the Michigan Street Baptist Church in Buffalo, New York. But they corresponded over the years, and Reverend Powell also visited Reverend Nash at the house at 36 Nash Street. And he also preached a sermon, especially during one of Reverend Nash's anniversaries at the Michigan Street Baptist Church. It was said at the time when Adam Clayton Powell had gone to Abyssinia. Abyssinia had one of the largest church memberships of many of the black churches in the country. The membership was 10,000 people. There were 10,000 members at Abyssinia Baptist Church. So the other thing that's close about this is Adam Clayton Powers Sr. was also born in Virginia, and he was born there in 1865. His book that he wrote, and this is a fiction book called Picketing Hell. He wrote other books as well, mostly nonfiction, but this one was, as he called it, a fictitious narrative. One of also Reverend Nash's acquaintance was Booker T. Washington. And Booker T. Washington was well known nationally, and Reverend Nash knew him through the association also at Virginia Union University. Even though Booker T was not a student there, he often frequented the school, and he had started at one time Ann Whelan Seminary, which later merged to become Virginia Union University. So one of the books in the collection that he has by Booker T is called The Story of My Life and Work. Okay, so The Wizard of Tuskegee, this book was ghostwritten by a person named Edgar Weber. Apparently, after Edgar wrote the book, which Booker T was traveling at the time the book was written, Booker T did not like what Edgar wrote, okay? And so in anger, he took Edgar's name off of the book, and he issued another volume of the book, but instead of having this one destroyed, he said, let's sell this one also to people who maybe can't afford the original book that has more information that I subscribe to. So he didn't destroy the copies of the book, he still put it out. He just left Edgar's name off of it, and he had another ghostwriter. But his official biography was called Up From Slavery, and that was the one that Booker T sanctioned to be the official book of his life. So Booker T, born in 1856, of course, we know was an educator, ended up being in charge of Tuskegee Institute, and during his time at Tuskegee, helped found over 5,000 schools, especially in the rural South. And he did that with the philanthropy and finances of Rosenwald. So you might have heard of Rosenwald schools. Rosenwald helped to help to build these schools if communities would chip in. And I found out later on that I attended a Rosenwald school in Florida, and that my community, the African American community, had to raise $1,000 in order to have the school built. And the school was Douglas School, named after Frederick Douglass. Now, Booker T, and this is a photo of Booker T. The interesting part about Booker T, there's a family photo of Booker T with 3 of his children. Booker T was married 3 times. His first wife died 2 years after they were married, and then he married his second wife. The first wife had 1 child, Portia, the daughter. The second wife had the 2 sons, Booker T. Washington Jr. and Ernest Washington. And the third wife, of course, was Margaret Washington. And Margaret was very heavily involved in the Colored Musicians Club, the Phyllis Wheatley Club. In fact, she was president of the Colored Musicians, why am I saying musician? The Colored Women's Clubs, which was a federation of women's clubs all over the country. She was one of the presidents at one time, but so was Miss Mary B. Talbot. She was also president of that National Colored Women's Club at one time. Another book in the collection is this book called Behind the Scenes, or 30 Years a Slave and 4 Years at the White House. Now, one of the reasons I think Reverend Nash might have acquired this book is because this particular edition was published in Buffalo in, let's see the date I have here. I don't have the date down, but it was published by a company called Stansel and Lee, Buffalo, New York. And Stansel was a minister, and he published this edition of the book. Now, Mary Todd Lincoln was born enslaved. She was able to purchase her freedom, and she was able to work in the White House as a dressmaker and somewhat as a confidant of Mary Todd Lincoln. So Mary Todd Lincoln did quite a number of confessions to Mary Keckley, who put them in her book. And later on, The book got banned, of course, because they said she shouldn't be talking like that about the First Lady. But the First Lady confided a lot in Keckley. And especially after the son died, after Lincoln's son died, Mrs. Mary Todd Lincoln probably felt alone, lonesome, and not having anybody to confide in, and she did a lot of confiding to Elizabeth Keckley, who was in the White House at that time. So in the foreword to the publisher, this is a picture of Elizabeth Keckley, and the foreword to the publisher shows that he was concerned that people might not know much about this book, but that it was a book that he felt should be read by many people, that they should know her story. And so he republished the book. And that might be how the book ended up in Reverend Nash's collection. I want to say, too, that we don't think Reverend Nash purchased all of the books in the house. We think he probably bought some of them, but we think that some were probably given to him by friends, by church members, by people that he knew, who knew that he liked reading and was well read and probably would donate books to him. Also in the collection, of course, was Uncle Tom's Cabin by Harriet Beecher Stowe. And it was called Uncle Tom's Cabin, A Life Among the Lowly. And this particular volume has 2 volumes in one, and it was published in 1871, now by a publisher in Boston. The book was written, of course, in 1852, and Harriet Beecher Stowe was also from one of the Quaker families that kind of believed in abolition and practiced abolition. And she was born in 1811. Now, when she published the book, many of her white readers thought that she had done a disservice by talking about slavery and enslavement. Many of the African American people thought that she did a good job because she was letting people know about slavery. Abraham Lincoln once said to her, "So this is the little lady who started the war." Of course, that was in reference to the Civil War, saying that you wrote the book that started the Civil War, which was not true, of course, but that was his compliment to her. So when she wrote the book, she had also read the life of Josiah Henson. Josiah Henson was born into slavery in Maryland. He escaped from Maryland and he escaped to go to Canada. His story is very interesting because when he escaped from Maryland, he ended up first in Ohio, and from Ohio he caught a boat to Buffalo, where he ended up at the foot of Ferry Street and waited to catch the ferry across the Niagara River to go to Canada, which he did. And when he crossed into Canada, that was in 1830, October 1830, he said in the book, the first thing he did, of course, was get on the ground and roll around and shout that he was free. He said people thought he was crazy, but it didn't matter to him because it was him, his wife, and 4 of his children who had made that trek. And he got to Canada by catching the ferry at the foot of Ferry Street onto Ontario. He stayed in the Fort Erie area for quite a long time, but eventually he and the family moved further up into Canada, closer to the Detroit area, closer to Windsor. He ended up with a settlement they called the Don Settlement. And at the Don Settlement, many African Americans who were seeking freedom, freeing the U.S., came to Don. He helped to establish them at the Don Settlement. There he had a sawmill where he had cut down trees, built a sawmill, had a community, had a church. He was a minister His son had taught him how to read. He had letters from the Queen of England, and he was the first person of African descent to be put on a Canadian stamp. So Josiah Henson has a long story. And also right now in Maryland, there is a Josiah Henson National Park where they talk about his life in Maryland. And I often write to them and say, and don't forget he crossed in Buffalo, trying to remind them that even though he was from Maryland, he crossed into Buffalo. Josiah Henson also has family in the Buffalo area still, and they also tell that story of part of his life. Now, this is one of the books that was in the collection, The Negro in American History by John W. Cromwell. And John W. Cromwell was secretary of the American Negro Academy. And what he did in this book was talk about men and women eminent in the evolution of the American of African descent. The book was published in 1914, and Cromwell was born 1846 in Virginia, died in 1927 in D.C. He was a lawyer, teacher, civil servant, journalist, historian, and the founder of the Bethel Literary and Historical Society and the American Negro Academy. So the Academy was also interested in books and book collection. As a matter of fact, after Cromwell retired from the Literary Society, the next president was Arthur Schomburg. And Arthur Schomburg, of course, was the person who had the large collection of books that now make up the Schomburg collection at the New York Public Library in Harlem. So they were into book collecting, book writing. And it's interesting to me that most of the books of this nature in Reverend Nash collection, these men were nationally known. They were writers. They published a lot, and they were known on the national circuit. Many of them were educated and had been to college and graduated from college. He also had the papers from John P. Davis. John P. Davis was one of the people who had founded the National Negro Congress. This Congress was dedicated to helping African Americans survive after the Depression. So there was a lot of talk about what to do, how to make life easier after the Depression that they had come out. Now, during World War I, Davis was secretary to Emmett J. Scott, and Emmett J. Scott was a special assistant to the U.S. Secretary of War. And at one time, Davis was the editor of The Crisis. When Du Bois left for a while, Davis edited The Crisis. There were other members of the National Negro Congress. Some of them included Ralph Bunche, Aileen Locke, A. Philip Randolph, and Charles Hamilton Houston. So these men had gotten together, and they were writing publications, and they wanted to call all of the prominent African American people who were writing together to have this Congress to discuss the plight of African Americans, especially after the Depression era. Another writer of this period was William Pickens. William Pickens was an orator, educator, and a journalist and a college professor. He was born 1881 in South Carolina. This heir of slaves and bursting bonds, these were autobiographies. And Kelly Miller wrote many books and publications during his time period. He was a proponent, and he espoused the views of W.E.B. Du Bois. A lot of the people during this time took sides. You were either for W.E.B. Du Bois or you were for Booker T. Washington. So they kind of chose which side they wanted to be on. I have not yet found out which side Reverend J. Edward Nash took. Okay, I do know that he was friends with Booker T. Washington. He was a member of Booker T's Negro Business and Professional Men's Group. But I know also that he helped found the NAACP, which of course that's bordering on W.E.B. Du Bois. I get the feeling that Reverend Nash kind of played the center, that he didn't really choose sides in the debate that was going on at that time, that he was kind of like the centrist, like kind of in the middle. I like what you say, and I like what you say, and I'll see what works or how we could work it out. So Bursting Bonds was one of those books. This was also like part of that autobiography. Campfires of the Afro-Americans. For people who say that African-American people didn't participate in any wars, you need to get a copy of this book, which is kind of rare right now, but Reverend Nash had one in his collection because this book talks about the colored man as a patriot. It deals with soldiers, sailors, heroes in the cause of free America, everywhere from colonial struggles, the American Revolution, the War of 1812, the Civil War, the Spanish-American War, everything up to 1899 with the war with the Filipinos. So there are illustrations in the book showing people who were important in those wars. There are also discussion of achievements of African Americans and what they did during those wars. So the book is just called Campfires of the Afro-American. It's a pretty large book, maybe 300 or 400 pages with lots of illustrations. Another book in the collection by Ben Franklin Riley was The White Man's Burden. The White Man's Burden also took a view of how white people could help in the emancipation of African Americans, telling them what they should do. It was a discussion of interracial questions with special reference to the responsibility of the white race to the Negro problem. They talked about things like even Negro womanhood, Christian humanitarianism. And the interesting part about Riley was more of the Booker T. Washington train of thought. He had met Booker T. Washington at one point, and Booker T. had invited Riley to come and speak at Tuskegee. And Riley had also written a biography of Booker T. Washington at one point. So in his book, he kind of takes that philosophy of Booker T. Washington, but he addresses what white people can do to address the African American problem that was going on in the community at the time. There are quite a number of pamphlets and books in the collection that deal with the Baptist Home Missions, the Baptist Home Association. And I find it very interesting because the Baptist Home Missions helped to establish quite a number of the black colleges and universities. One of them that they helped to fund was Virginia Union University, where Reverend Nash was. So maybe he was kind of feeling indebted or feel like he might have a responsibility to be responsible to this group. They also fund about 6 or 7 other black colleges in the South. They gave financial donations to help this do. They helped to found the Wayland Seminary, where Nash first started, and also the Virginia Union University. And I'm sure they had influence on Baptist churches nationwide, probably even the Michigan Street Baptist Church. And that might have also influenced Nash to consider coming to Buffalo because the Baptist Union, this group of people, were very involved in Baptist churches, and they had also supported him in his education at Virginia Union. So I think it kind of all ties together, if I'm kind of able to follow that thread, that he knew of the union, he supported it, he worked for them. He has lots of papers and pamphlets of meetings and things that were going on with the Baptist Union. And I think he probably felt that they were a good group because they had helped to fund the place where he was educated. Now, not all the books were historical, so I found this one, the Book of Wonders. And I'm like, what kind of wonders were there in 1915? It's somewhat like an encyclopedia. So in the Book of Wonders, I just turned to a page and found invention of the pen. This is like the ink pen. So there's a whole picture about the invention of the ink pen, invention of flight, invention of the typewriter. And these were like modern conveniences and inventions of that particular time. So here's a whole book of wonders where you could look in and see when something was invented, how important was it, what went into making it important, what went into inventing that. Another book that he had signed himself was called The Tower of London, and this was written by William Harrison Ainsworth, published in London in 1871. It's a historical romance that describes the history of Lady Jane Grey from the time of Queen of England to her execution. So he wasn't just reading the Bible, okay? He had some novel reading, as I would say, something maybe not totally historic that he wanted to read in his pastime. And the fact that he inscribed his name in there probably means that this might have been a book that he purchased himself. And how was he keeping up on the world's best literature? Well, here's a condensed form, the masterpieces of the world's best literature. So in this particular book, he could find out writings by different people. There would be a piece by Edgar Allan Poe. There'd be a piece by Wendell Phillips. There'd be a piece by some of the Greek writers. So just a synopsis, but not the entire books that they might have written. So if you just needed to kind of be up and have a synopsis of the literature that was out there, you would read the masterpieces of the world's best literature so that you would have a focal point that you might even use in your sermons when you prepare your sermons. This, I'm not sure, was Reverend Nash's book. I'm thinking this might have been one of Jesse Jr.'s books. Foreign Spies, Dr. Doom, and the Ghost Submarine, published in 1939. And the villain, of course, is Dr. Doom. And it's interesting that later on in this century, Stan Lee, who wrote a lot of the Marvel comic books, he also got a Dr. Doom. I don't know if he got his Dr. Doom from this Dr. Doom, because this one was published earlier. But it's like, not comic book form, but like a little fiction novel, supernatural kind of thing, something that I think young boys probably would have been interested in reading at that time. I can't say it belonged to Jesse Jr. It could actually have belonged to Reverend Nash. I mean, he was reading just about everything, you could tell from his library that he had everything in there. How was he keeping up on world policy and world events? Through the Negro Digest. Interesting though, the Negro Digest was only published from July 1940 to December 1940. And so Reverend Nash, we found the November 1940 issue that he had. But it had articles in there by Claude McKay. Earl Conrad had wrote about Harriet Tubman. Paul Robeson had wrote, Ralph Ellison, W.E.B. Du Bois. They had all written articles. And 2 years after this publication closed, in 1942, John Johnson from Chicago, who published Jet and Ebony, also published a Negro Digest using the same format, taking many writers, and they would have essays or poems or even short plays in the book, and it was topical. There would be a whole issue on playwrights, a whole issue on literature, a whole issue on Africa. So he took that same format that they had in the 40s from this Negro Digest and began to publish another one called Negro Digest in 1942. And after that morphed into Black World that John Johnson put out. And then, of course, Ebony is no more. It's online now. So Ebony, Jet, Black World, all those publications are no longer available in print form. The Ebony, I think, is online, but the others have ceased publication altogether. And one other to show, he kept up with local events by the Holley's Weekly, published by Reverend Lewis W. Holley. And I'm often asked, am I related? I don't think we are, Kenneth. I don't know where Reverend Lewis was from, but that name has not come up in my genealogy discussion. But Reverend Lewis published a weekly magazine in Buffalo. The Nash has about 9 copies of the magazine. The first issue has Reverend Lewis on it. The second issue has Hannah Lewis, Reverend Lewis' wife. They would have church news, news about the community, things to think about. Reverend Lewis went on to become the founder of Evangelistic Temple Church, which started on Jefferson Avenue, but is now on Headley Place in Buffalo. That church is still in operation. But he died in Buffalo in 1944. And this is just an example of some of the things that he would have in there on a weekly basis. So he would go around and get the news of the churches, probably from their announcements that they made in church, and get other information as well. So what are you reading, Reverend Nash? This is a picture of Reverend Nash in his study. He took the front room of the house for his study. And in that study, he has his desk and bookcases and bookcases and bookcases full of the books that he had in his collection. Also had books in the bedroom, and Mrs. Nash had her own collection of books in other places and pamphlets in other places, and Jesse Jr. had books in his room. So this was a reading family. They had books all over. And he is sitting at his desk. This is a wax figure of Reverend Nash, and he's holding a book in his hand that he's reading from. So we say, what are you reading, Reverend Nash? And I'm sure with the collection that he has, there was always something to read. So I want to thank you for listening, and at this time, I'll take any questions or comments that you might have. Yes, Charles.
How about photographs? Were there any photographs of Reverend Nash with Clayton Powell or E.B. Du Bois, anything like that?
We do have a photograph of Reverend and Mrs. Nash standing with Reverend Adam Clayton Powell and his wife when they came to Buffalo. So the photograph was taken at the Michigan Street Church. That's the only one that I've seen with them together. Okay, I have not seen any photographs of he and Booker T. Washington or W.E.B. Du Bois, even though he has photographs of them in the collection, but I haven't seen any where they are standing together. And he has lots of photographs. Some we have not been able to identify. I think last year we did a program called Reverend Nash Letters to World War II Soldiers, and these soldiers had sent photographs to Reverend Nash. Those who we were able to identify, we identified with the letter, to put the letter and the photograph together. but some had no identification. He has photographs of people that I'm not sure if they were relatives, members of the church, friends, neighbors, because some have no identification on them. I tried taking the book out one time with copies of them, and people would say, oh, everybody who know them are probably dead now. They don't know who they are. Any other questions? Yes, Wanda.
The book that you thought was Junior's book.
Uh-huh.
Are there any others like that that you can say, well, was that just the one in his collection, or did you find any of Junior's books that were similar?
It wasn't with that one, so there might be some other ones there, but it wasn't together. Okay, so I don't know if there were other copies of Dr. Doom. That's what you mean? Or
Any other to more identify if it was the son's part?
Well, there were some books in the son's room that were probably more youth oriented, that I could say, okay, probably the son had this from the publication date of it would be when the son would have it. But this one had an older date on it, so I'm wondering, I don't know who read this. Yes.
Sharon, regarding the Nash House, is that being promoted in conjunction with the African American Corridor?
Yes, it is. We're one of the 4 anchors that are in the Michigan Street African American Corridor. The Nash House Museum is one. The Michigan Street Baptist Church is the second one. The Colored Musicians Club and Jazz Museum is the third. And the WUFO radio station with Black Radio Archives is the fourth. So I'll point you to a director of the Michigan Street Corridor is here. Okay, Terry Alford, raise your hand. Sal, if you got more questions. Okay, but we're trying to coordinate a heritage campus in that area to be able to tell the stories of people who lived and worked and came to that area. It's a rich part of African American history for Western New York. And a lot of it has been overlooked, or not written about, but we're trying to change that now.
If I could just add real quick to, because you asked the question, she called me out, is how the Nash House is situated. A lot of people don't see it. They go right by it sometimes. And unfortunately, it's right next to the Broadway garage.
Right.
So we're working on doing something to make the Nash House stand out a little better, where people can actually see it. And if they see it, they'd be hopefully frequent it more. But more importantly, I think what Sharon didn't mention here is the Heritage Corridor is actually looking to work with the Nash House to expand the house. It's a house. It's a 2-story house. And you can, at only one time, maybe get 20 visitors at a time in there. So the Heritage Corridor is working with the Michigan Street Preservation Corporation to look at ways to expand the house. We're presently negotiating with the city to acquire city-owned property there. And what we hope to do is build an annex that attaches to the house, not compromises the house. But if we could do that, that would allow for larger space to accommodate more visitors. But more importantly, we can actually exhibit more of Reverend Nash's and his wife, Frances, and even Jesse's, more of their personal effects in the house at one given time.
All right. Yeah.
Something about Reverend Nash, what he read. Did he ever write any books?
I have not seen any books that he wrote. He did keep outlines and some sermons for 58 years. 58 years of sermons and sermon outlines. And I do want to say that most of the paperwork that was found in the house when the renovation first started, Dr. Monroe Fordham and members from the Afro-American Historical Association and UB were able to microfilm, this was before the age of digitization, was able to microfilm those papers. So the microfilm is available to view here at the Frank Merriweather Library in the Miles African American Room, and they're also available at the Butler Library at Buffalo State College. And we have been working on trying to digitize some of them, which would make them more available. And some are digitized, but a lot of it is not. So I haven't seen where he wrote any books, just correspondence, just outlines of sermons, a lot of correspondence. I think he replied to everybody who wrote to him, and he kept a copy. And people wrote to him, lots of letters like, I am recommending this person. Somebody asked him could you help him get a job? So I'm recommending this person to you for employment. He comes from a good family. He will be an excellent worker, you know, kind of introductory things like that. Also letters from clergymen in returns to church work or what you're doing with the church. And some personal letters from Reverend Adam Clayton Powell, you know. He say, how's your son doing? You know, I'm going to be up there. Letters from Miss Mary B. Talbot, you know. I'm traveling, I'm doing this, but I haven't forgotten my church. You know, my hat still fits on my head. It's not too big, you know. Letters like that.
How were all of these things able to be, when and how were they able to be preserved?
Before.
Well, just in general, how all this stuff was able to be preserved?
How was it able?
Yeah.
Well, I would say back in the 1990s, and I attribute a lot of what's preserved now to the past president, Mr. George K. Arthur, you know, who's deceased. But they had a vision to preserve these papers and things because when they walked into the house, they found that Reverend Nash and Mrs. Nash and their papers were all there. These people didn't throw out anything, okay? I always say when I'm doing tours, Mr. Arthur said they were preservationists. I like to think of myself as a preservationist too, but they were hoarders. Okay, I'm probably one too. They kept it all, you know, every paper, you know, everything. And so when it was time to create the museum, they said, well, first let's try to not throw anything out. Keep the papers, preserve the papers. 99% of everything in the house belonged to the Nash family. So we have their records. We repaired their Victrola where we can play their records when people come up so they can actually hear what the Nash were listening to when they would sit around. Their piano is there, dishes is there, hats from Mrs. Nash, hats from Reverend Nash. And so because it's a small place, upstairs is like the museum, but some things have been preserved and, you know, are under glass for people to see. But it's not nearly as much as there. So in order to put more things on display, we would have to have, say, a build-out. In other words, all the books, you can just see the spines of the books when you come there, but you can't like pull the book off the shelf, and that would be kind of detrimental to do anyway because it would destroy it. But that's how things have been saved thus far. Did I answer?
Was the house always owned by the Nash family and then they turned it over to?
The house was purchased by Reverend Nash and his wife in 1925. So they did not build the house. The house was already there. There were families living along the street, which was Potter Street. So they purchased the house in 1925, and they owned it from 1925. So Reverend Nash died first, 1957. There was about 30 years difference in ages between he and Mrs. Nash. She still lived in the house after he passed away. She moved to a nursing home in 1985 and died in 1987. Jesse Jr., their only son, still owned the house, And because we wanted to make a museum, he deeded the house to the Michigan Street Preservation Corporation to turn it into a museum. Any other questions? Yes.
I was just wondering, did anybody ever tape Jesse Nash Jr. or Mrs. Nash talking about Reverend Nash?
Doug Ruffin has a tape of Jesse Nash Jr., I know. But I don't know if anybody, I have never heard a tape of Reverend Nash. I don't know how his voice sounded. That's,
Because both of them were talkers, you know.
yes,
Yeah.
yes.
We could spell out and stuff about the books and other things in the house if anybody ever taped them. And he definitely could talk, both of them.
Right, right. To my knowledge, I don't know if anybody taped Reverend Nash. I'd have to find out about Mrs. Nash because she lived, you know, in the 87. And I know, you remember we were getting ready to tape Mrs. Hortense Nash, Jesse Nash's wife, and then she passed away before we could get out there. I mean, but we would go to see her in the nursing home, and yeah, she was really up on everything, you know, talking and everything. And like you said, Jesse Nash Jr., you would just have to back away from him when he started, because he could talk for hours.
Was that because he was Professor Canisius?
That might have been, but even before then, you know, if you cornered him on any subject, he'd give you an earful. Any other questions?
Where were Reverend Nash's parents from?
They were from Virginia. Right.
They were born in slavery?
From the records I've seen of him and from what I've looked from census data, they were born in Virginia. Okay, so they lived in Virginia. And one incident I saw where the wife had been formerly enslaved and the father had been a freed man, but I don't know if he was enslaved first and then freed. That wasn't very clear. I do know from some of Reverend Nash papers, he said his father became very ill when they were young, when the children were young, and that Jesse and his siblings had to go to work to help the mom out because she was really not making any money. So they did everything, you know.
How many siblings?
There were 3 of them.
Small family for back then.
Right. Yes. Yes.
Did Jesse Jr. have a kid?
Yes, he did. He has 3 adult children. 2 are living in the Buffalo area, and 1 daughter lives in Maryland. Okay. And so, as you know, Jesse Nash Jr. is also deceased, you know, and according to the children, he has just as much stuff in his house as mom and dad. So I don't think they've gone through it all yet.
Just a side note, my aunt, who's 99, used to live, she grew up on Water,
Okay.
and remembers going to the house to play with the son.
Oh, wow.
Would be 100 and something.
Wow. Is she still living?
Oh, yeah.
We need to tape her. We need to get that tape of her talking about, because what we would love to do is to create an oral history of people who lived in the neighborhood and who knew the families that lived in the neighborhood. So there are a lot of people who knew Reverend Nash, or they either went to the church, Michigan Street Church, and we would love to be able to talk to them and have them tell their personal stories about how they knew them or what they knew of them. I do know that when Reverend Nash retired from preaching in 1953, that the new minister who came in, Reverend Porter, moved the church from Michigan Street to Humboldt Parkway. So the church on Humboldt Parkway Baptist Church, that's a functioning church today. That is the original congregation that came from Michigan Street. They didn't move the name. They took the name of where the new church was, Humboldt Parkway. They left the Michigan Street name at Michigan. So other congregations occupied the sanctuary at Michigan Street, one of those being Macedonia Baptist Church. They moved in there and they used the church until they built the church over on High Street. Another was Bishop Henderson and his congregation. They moved into the Michigan Street Baptist Church. But the original membership of Michigan Street Baptist Church had gone to Humboldt Parkway. Any other questions? Well, thank you so much for coming out, and I invite all of you, if you have not, to make an appointment to visit us at the Nash House Museum and see some of this for yourself. So thank you again for coming.